You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 311 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. News today on good things happening in the U.S. Congress, updates on the regime change situation in Venezuela, and I want to talk about some wars going on across Africa. Share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find it online is at the Libertarian Institute. You can find my daily news roundup and the show right there on the homepage, so just type in libertarianinstitute.org. You can also donate to the show on Patreon at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I do put up a little bit of bonus content that you get access to. Up first today is some good news. The House of Representatives passed a bill that invokes the War Powers Act to withdraw the U.S. from the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen. In a lot of ways, it's way too late, as we're almost 4 years into that war now. And who knows how many people have, died from the violence in that conflict, although we know with Eddlem that the number is getting close to 80,000, or is more than 80,000 now. And then the number of people, who have since died of deprivation and starvation and cholera and all kinds of other terrible things, that number could, be well into the hundreds of thousands. As I talked about on the show, this humanitarian crisis going on in Yemen is mostly human created by the Saudi state and the, coalition, along with the Emirates, the United States, the Egyptians, and also gained significant support from European countries like the UK. Until recently, Germany and the Netherlands were still selling Saudi Arabia weapons as well. So there's a lot of global guilt to go around here, but at the end of the day, the suffering party is the people of Yemen, who, it's hard to even say, pose the threat to the world outside of their own borders, although there was a civil war in that country. However, the world has, since opposed itself on Yemen, and the U.S. really needs to withdraw from this coalition. It's a horrific kind of thing, and we play such a critical role, especially if we could withdraw the support that we give Saudi Arabia in intelligence and logistics, mid-air refueling, and maintenance on the aircraft. All these things Saudi Arabia really can't do on their own, so what they're mostly doing in Yemen is waging an air campaign. And so without the U.S. support, Saudi's ability to do that would definitely be limited, if not, at some point in the near future, come to a halt. Next up is to get this bill through the Senate. It already passed last year. So I think there's a good chance we pass it again this year. I'm not really concerned. The fear here is that Trump is going to end up vetoing it, and then you're going to need 2/3 in each House to override that veto. That is where I think the numbers could start to get tricky, but I guess take it one step at a time. And, as I discussed it on the show and as you see in the news, that this is going to be something coming up in the Senate, make sure you're calling your senators and telling them to support it. If, maybe if the House or in the Senate get near or majority proof number or veto proof numbers here, then maybe the Trump administration just wouldn't veto it because they know they could get overruled. So, public sentiment here is important. I can't imagine that Donald Trump is all that interested himself in fighting this war. I mean, yeah, he wants to support the Saudi royal family and he thinks it's great for the United States to be selling them weapons. However, at some point, I would imagine that he would abandon his support for Saudi Arabia should the political tables turn in the United States on this war. YouTube stuff. So apparently YouTube is now censoring conspiracy theory videos, and their censor or means of censorship, I guess, is to not recommend any of these conspiracy videos. Now, the first and most obvious question that wasn't asked really at all in the article I read on it is, what the hell is a conspiracy video? I mean, as far as I could tell, is if you believe that Russia hacked the 2016 election, that's a conspiracy. And so are all of Rachel Maddow's videos now going to be censored on YouTube? I really doubt it. It seems to me that what a conspiracy video is going to be labeled is anything that exists outside of the mainstream narrative. And so it's not going to be a conspiracy if you believe that Assad used chemical weapons against his own people, or that Russia hacked the 2016 election, but maybe making points like Barack Obama and the United States helped lead to the rise of ISIS in Syria by arming the Sunni resistance to Assad. This kind of stuff will get labeled, oh, you're calling Obama a Muslim terrorist, so then you must be a conspiracy theorist. The longer this censorship movement of online media goes on, the more concerning it is to me. It's certainly gone the way that, the people have initially predicted, which was at first, basically what they're going to do is they're going to go through and they're going to just get rid of the videos that are intentionally crude. Anything with, excessive violence, child pornography, just the worst kind of racist stuff. People like worshiping Hitler and, maybe people wearing Klan robes pretending to, crack racist jokes and stuff like that. And so most people don't have a problem with that. But it has since bled into, now people are getting banned, as I have Peter Van Buren on the show. And, he was banned from Twitter for making a joke, a zombie joke towards a journalist. And so without a real big debate on what is conspiracy and what kind of stuff are we blocking and who makes that determination on what that is, and then having that information out there in public, as we know with Facebook, who's making the determination is people like the Atlantic Council, so very, pro-establishment. At some point in the show, I should probably have, somebody on who knows about technology and search engines and social media and all that to kind of discuss what alternatives to Google and Chrome and Facebook and Twitter, where you could ensure that, you're not going to be censored or shadow banned or your content's not going to be recommended. As a content producer, I really know how difficult it is to try to get your content without being paid, because once it's sponsored, I think people believe less likely, that's something that they're actually interested in. And so to have your this, channel or video somewhere where it's recommended by the, platform that is something that you may like, that's a big deal. And that could really help generate, new viewers and subscribers and all that. But it seems that YouTube is, really stuck on taking this away from people. And then, what starts to happen when, they bump these things down in the search result rankings. And so it may be that one day, whenever you type in 9/11, you really only see the George Bush, Dick Cheney, establishment narrative, and you never get that other side. And not that I'm a 9/11 truther or anything like that, but it's not like the opposition in what, Bush and Cheney and the rest of them did in relation to 9/11 is somehow worse for society than people believing that they orchestrated it to take advantage like they have in the Middle East. All right, so we have this budget thing going on, and it looks like the Pentagon is going to request a huge increase. I think the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund or account that they have is something close to $100 billion right now, but they want that increase next year to $174 billion. Now, the problem with this account is that none of the money is allocated. So what Congress says is for them to fight the wars, and because, you really can't predict what's going to happen in war. And, we see this easily just from a quick example, Iraq, where we send all of our armor over there, and it turns out the IEDs take out. And actually, as I listened to a podcast, and a soldier explained, when we first went over there, they were just rolling around in pickup trucks without armor. And so there really wasn't an anticipation from the U.S. military going into the Iraqi war that they would need these very specific armor-resistant vehicles to safely transport U.S. troops in and around Iraqi cities. And so for that reason, it doesn't make sense for Congress to yearly allocate money, specifically to buying pickup trucks or buying MRAPs or whatever the military needs, because you don't know what those war needs are. However, that also means that Congress has very little oversight on what happens in this account. We already know that the Pentagon could just lie about their budget anyways. However, this one adds even more so like a slush fund, because they could do whatever they want with this money. And so to continue to increase this is just more and more Congress giving away their congressional war-making duties, having less sight over what's going on with the Pentagon, all of our overseas operations. I mean, I'll talk about this later on the show, but we're waging this war in Somalia right now. Trump is carrying out 14 airstrikes or so already this year, and yet there's no vote in Congress to authorize this. The group Al-Shabaab wasn't formed till years after 9/11 happened. And then, you get these national security reviews and all these reports that, what we really need to be worried about is Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And nobody can really point to how Somali politics relates in any way to Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran, or that Al-Shabaab is some kind of existential threat to the United States. Yet we're ramping up a war there. And so here again, this is, giving the Pentagon more money to do things like this, carry out these little mission creep style wars where we do a little bit more every year in all these countries. And again, as we'll talk about more Africa later in the show, these wars are really, instability is increasing across the Sahel region of Africa. And so I think there's a lot of danger to giving the Pentagon just all this kind of blank check money, because who knows what they're going to do with it and where they're going to wage war, because there's obviously no limits going to come from Congress. And the president just, is willing, I think, to let the Pentagon pretty much do what they want. Real quick, I read this report from ACLED, and I'm not sure, exactly what to make of it or anything, but it is disturbing and just a reminder of why it's so important that we start to roll back all this conflict overseas. And the amount of child soldiers in the past 5 years has increased 159%. I can't imagine the long-term effects on a culture whenever you take your children and you put guns in your hand and you force them to shoot other people. I mean, it must be absolutely traumatic. And I know that there is a lot of very heroic work done by people who, when these child soldiers become demilitarized, go in and really work with them and try to figure out how to get them to live some kind of normal, healthy life. And so the long-term effects of having all these child soldiers is going to be devastating, on the different regions and where they're being used. I think a lot of it is Yemen, Congo, South Sudan. And then I'm going to link to this article in the show notes page. Because I've talked about this case and there wasn't a whole lot of new stuff, but I do want to bring up that, this originally alleged Russian spy, Marina Butina, is still, I believe, in a solitary confinement cell, having pled guilty and is waiting, sentencing for not being a Russian spy, but basically, I think, being a casualty of the anti-Russia hysteria in the United States. So if you want to read this girl's life story to understand that she's clearly not a Russian spy, you could find it. James Bamford writes it in the New Republic. It's linked in the show notes page. And he basically explains in details who she is, how, she kind of got here, and how she's clearly not a spy. And that's not even a charge anymore. The other thing I just have to bring up with this story, because it upsets me so much, is that you have things like this Me Too moment and all this very pro-feminism rhetoric coming out of places like MSNBC and CNN, and a real demonization of everybody who doesn't adopt those principles. However, you now have this case with Maria Butina because, she's Russian and attractive. They claim that she's trading, sets for influence, and that's how she got to where she was. And originally, that's part of the narrative against her that's supposed to prove that she's a Russian spy. And so this seems to be a clearly sexist allegation against this woman who apparently didn't commit this at all and is now admitted by everyone. But yet nobody is held responsible on that level. All right, on to some Venezuela news. Senator James Inhofe, this guy's a real nut apparently, said that if Russia deploys weapons to Venezuela, the U.S. could use force in response. Not a whole lot of clarity on what use force means. If it would be an attempt to keep the Russian ship from entering Venezuela and delivering the weapons, or if it would be, actually carrying out a bombing of those weapons deployed. The fear here is that the Russians recently deployed a couple of supersonic nuclear capable bombers to Venezuela just for a couple of days. They're not there anymore. But if that were to happen again, does Inhofe think that the United States should then bomb these Russian planes? And does that mean war with Russia? Of course, the fear here is that any kind of conflict with Russia starting off, no matter how small, could quickly escalate. And while in Syria, I think there's some good things to point to, that there have been Russians killed by Americans, although not troops. And those issues have worked out without the result of nuclear war and, kind of spiraling, worsening tensions. But when you look at examples like what happened with the Salisbury poisoning and the resulting very downward spiral of U.S. and Russian diplomatic relations in response to that. So, U.S. bombs those Russian planes in Venezuela. Russia does something in retaliation to the United States. The U.S. escalates twice as much. And, it could get really nasty really quick. Part of this is a reason why, as Lucy Steigenwald points out in a recent Reason article, and I'll also link to this in the show notes page, we really need to adopt this No First Use Act. And basically what it would do is codify in law that the U.S. should never use nuclear weapons first. This is really important as the U.S. is developing new low-yield nuclear weapons. And so, they're really small, and we're just going to use this one low-yield nuclear weapon to, show the Russians, that we really mean it, and we could get really nasty. And so you don't want to mess with us, pal. But the fear is that Russia isn't going to respond by saying, you used a little nuke, so our hands are up, you could do whatever you want. It's that you used a little nuke, so we're going to use a big nuke because we're not going to let you use anymore. So I'll link to Lucy's article in the show notes page. But I do want to say, I don't think, again, with the importance of this law isn't necessarily that I think if Donald Trump were deciding to hit the nuclear button or not, he would go, there is that no first use law. The importance, I think, would be is just, if we create an environment where the people demand our president has a no first use policy, then we elect somebody who wouldn't hit the button first. So as we continue to watch the Venezuelan regime change effort, there are a couple things still ongoing, although it doesn't seem like the status quo in Venezuela is changing in a way to suggest that Maduro is going to lose his hands on power. But the U.S. is still, I think, trying to rally the Venezuelan military to recognize the Guaido government. I haven't seen any indication that that is actually going to happen. The other battle is for Venezuelan assets overseas, and a big one is in the boardroom of Citgo, where I think the U.S. is trying to facilitate more people friendly to the Guaido government to, sit on that board. The real complicated thing is that Citgo is owned by the Venezuelan state oil company that the U.S. now says is essentially the property of Juan Guaido and his government, whereas the Venezuelan government says that they still are the owners of that. And so there's a lot of confusion there, and I think this is probably the most likely battle that the U.S. and Guaido and the West, could push to maybe get these assets in Guaido's name. Now, how he could ever facilitate those funds coming to the United States or Venezuela, and what that would look like, I don't know. I mean, we're still a long ways off here. But it does seem like since all of these Venezuelan assets like the gold in the Bank of England and like Citgo are in these countries, it's going to be hard for Maduro to maintain his control over them. I also want to point out, and I'll link to this in the show notes page as well, Scott Horton interviewed one of the Libertarian Institute writers on, kind of the situation in Venezuela. And he does paint quite a different picture than I've talked about on this show recently, Dan McAdams, Scott Horton, Mats Blumenthal, Greg Paulist, of kind of the situation in Venezuela and who should be recognized as that country's government. Now, I think everybody agrees that the United States really aren't the people to be making that call, but, it's worth pointing out that I believe in 2015, the opposition to Maduro did overwhelmingly win a congressional election. And it was through some trickery by the Maduro government impacting the country's Supreme Court that he was able to prevent those opposition to kind of collect together into a 2/3 majority enough to oust him as the country's president. And then the Maduro government has since adopted a kind of new congressional body and packed it with their own people. So this does cast some light and paints the Maduro government as being less legitimate than before. It doesn't obviously change in any way if I think there should be a regime change there. But it is important in understanding, what's happening in Venezuela and why. And so if we do start to see in upcoming weeks a larger and larger opposition to Maduro, it does seem there's, more popular support than I thought before for that opposition. In Iran, there was a pretty big suicide bombing. It was by a rebel group that in part is based in Pakistan. 41 people were killed in the attack, and depending on what source you read, between 24 and 25, and all of them were members of the IRGC, and some apparently being pretty high ranking. Because it is the IRGC, I would expect the Iranian kind of military wing to respond fairly hawkishly to this. So, it could lead to any kind of atrocities or human rights violations. Also, with a large portion of this group being based in Pakistan, the Iranians either trying to put pressure on Pakistan. I doubt trying to invade Pakistan or anything like that. But there could be some diplomatic shakeups here in the way the Middle East plays out because of this attack. So just want to, mention that. And of course, it's always horrific and a reminder that Iran is a country that's been victimized by these Sunni radical groups that carry out suicide bombings, whether it be this particular separatist or counter-government group, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Iran is not their friend, despite the, kind of U.S. general claims that Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terror. Iran is actually one of the countries that's very victimized by terrorism. Russia, too, on this point. They're, just forgotten in the kind of American centric view that most people have on foreign policy. The Iraqi prime minister said while the U.S. acting secretary of defense was either on his way to or in the Middle East, that Iraq would not allow any foreign military bases to be permanent in their country. So that really suggests the U.S. is going to have to get rid of their base there at some point or figure out a way to negotiate with the Iraqi government. But it really throws some cold water on Trump's plan, I guess, to wash Iran from Iraq. The acting Secretary of Defense also visited Afghanistan, and there he said that he has received no direct orders from Donald Trump to withdraw any U.S. forces from that country. I'm hoping to see some kind of official statement from the Trump administration soon, because that's really what he needs to do. If he doesn't say, I order the military to do this by this day, I think the military is going to do everything they can to prevent that withdrawal from happening. And, generally the U.S. consensus as well. And so unless you set a date and say that this is happening by this day, the deadline could continue to be pushed back further and further. I do expect to see that announcement on Syria coming relatively soon. Within the next month for sure, but I would guess within the next couple of weeks. I think one of the, really bad parts about Trump's foreign policy so far has been that I think what he wants to do is to get these wars over with. And the way Trump views war and the way he gets a war over with is to just carry out a lot of bombings, do a lot very quickly, and then, you'll defeat the enemy and then you could come home. And so, don't mess around with this counterinsurgency stuff and all these little nation building programs. You bomb everybody you need to bomb and then everything's better and you leave. Or at least it's not your problem. Now, the problem with, Trump on this strategy is that he's able to do the first part very well because everybody's on board. Yeah, we could bomb more. Bomb Somalia more, bomb Iraq and Syria more, bomb Afghanistan more. 2018 was the highest of the recorded year, so since 2009 of U.S. munitions dropped on Afghanistan. But he's not very good at doing the second part. He hasn't withdrawn from anywhere yet. And so if you never had the withdrawal, then, any amount of saying, oh, well, it's not great that he's carrying out all these extra bombings, but at least eventually the troops are coming home. You can't give him any credit there. Next, I want to move on to Somalia, and Amanda Sperber had a great piece recently in The Nation on, what that U.S. war looked like and just how little information the American people actually know about it. I mean, the U.S. says there were 50 strikes in Somalia last year, but a lot of the strikes are, clearly seen as just being not admitted to. There's cases where the Pentagon will 6 months later admit that they carried out certain strikes, but it's only after people ask. And so I guess unless everybody in the Congress is going and trying to get this information out to the public, it's just not going to come out fast enough. And we're not going to have a true count of U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. Now, the other thing is that every time there is a U.S. strike in Somalia, there's absolutely no reporting going on in the ground. Amanda Sperber points out several reasons for this, but in part, Al-Shabaab, which controls a large portion of Somalia, mostly where the airstrikes are being carried out, doesn't allow smartphones. The U.S. intelligence in Somalia isn't very good, and the Somali National Army is very weak. And so you have the U.S. drop these strikes in Somalia, and then they just say, these are usually released by AFRICOM, and they say 12 Al-Shabaab militants were killed, 50 were killed, 10 were killed, 8 were killed, 7 were killed. And you just get these numbers and they pile up and they add up, but never do they admit to killing a civilian, and never is there any additional reporting that say, eyewitnesses confirmed that these were Al-Shabaab militants, or we were able to confirm the identities of these 3 people who were killed. None of that. And then, the nation has some reporting that goes on in Somalia, and they turn up all these witnesses who say, yeah, my neighbor's house was blown up on this day. He was definitely not a member of Al-Shabaab. She does point out that part of the confusion in all of this could be that part of the airstrikes here are carried out by the CIA, possibly because it's an area of active hostility and they could carry out these drone strikes without, I believe, oversight from the executive even. So it's possible that, these are Predator drones dropping these and not all U.S. military. I really have no idea what the status of the actual war against Al-Shabaab is, how strong they are, how much popular support they have. But just like anywhere else, it's really impossible for the U.S. to completely defeat an insurgency through an air campaign, and it's pretty clear that the Somali National Army is very weak and very corrupt. In fact, every time I read a story in detail about the Somali National Army, several other commanders are former al-Shabaab commanders, so it's not like there's even a clear distinction between the military and the enemy. Moving on to Libya, the important news here is that there's, 3 or so governments in that country. One of those governments being the US-backed UN government. You had the government of General Khalifa Haftar, who a former Gaddafi general, then turned into CIA coup guy. And then when that didn't work, he ran to the United States and hid out in Virginia for a while. And then when Gaddafi got overthrown, he showed up back in that country. And then there's another militant group that holds territory. Now, the US-backed UN government is in the west of the country, as long as with the other militants. And then Haftar largely controls the east of the country. The southern portion of the country, I believe there's some sporadic cities, but is generally held by whatever local militia is in place, and there's not like a united governing agreement down there. Now, some of the oil fields are located in southern Libya, and one of those oil fields, in fact, Libya's largest oil field, has been shut down for quite some time now as local militants took over, and some people call them protesters, some people call them militants, have shut down those oil fields. Haftar has moved south and has taken the largest oil field and is looking to, I guess, now reopen it, saying that it's secure and safe to, send the workers in and operate it. I think this is a pretty big move for his government. A lot of the main exporting areas of Libya are in, his kind of eastern half of the country. And so if he's controlling these major oil fields, it could be a big boon for him to be able to start raising a lot of funds and then, buy more and more support from the country. 2019 will probably be a big year for Libya, as there's supposed to be elections held in that country. You also have the wild card that Gaddafi's son and heir apparent, Saif al-Islam, is apparently alive and no longer a hostage. Last I heard, somewhere in eastern Libya. And he could be somebody either had an election been held or through just kind of popular support is able to ascend to be the ruler of Libya. Either way, it doesn't seem like the US-backed government there is doing very well, as they're constantly shutting down the Tripoli airport because it's being attacked by militants. As I said, southern Somalia, I guess, is kind of lawless, and just different militant groups hold different territory down there. And so this allowed some Chadian country south of Libya, there's Chad, rebels to hide out in Libya. They recently crossed back into Chad in an attempt to do a coup d'etat, and the French intervened with airstrikes to prevent this coup d'etat from happening. I don't have a whole lot else to say about that. I don't know very much about the politics of Chad. Again, I had talked about this in the past on the show. France does have a long-standing colonial and influence interest in northern Africa and the Sahel region. So we continue to see this interference. In Burkina Faso, there's ongoing instability in that country, and I guess some militants were trying to get together and try to do a coup d'etat. This was prevented by the government there, but apparently it was pretty cruel in that, they went down and they executed a whole bunch of people in front of their families. These kind of, very raw power kind of strawman moves may quell rebellion in the short term, but probably creates a lot of long-term resistance to the government and just ensures that this, perpetuates for generations. Increasing instability in Mali as well. We have the UN warning about this, as well as ACLED, who says in 2019, keep an eye on the general Sahel region. So, we've talked already about Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, in the past on the show, Sudan, South Sudan, where there's a lot of unrest in different militant groups. JNIM is the Al-Qaeda offshoot that controls a lot of territory in Mali now. They're a collection of the former AQIM and some other militia groups that have kind of sprung up in reaction to the instability created in Libya, where you have a bunch of Tory militants leave Libya and have since taken up arms against the central government in Mali. So in part, this is spillover from the U.S. war. In part, the violence there is just the general instability of the country, regardless of U.S., current intervention in Mali. But, this is something to be concerned about, especially, as I said, we have this, massive Pentagon budget where they could just go around the world waging war where they want. A president who has taken his hands off of control of what the CIA does, so they're, could carry out airstrikes around the world. And certainly if they start to see, these terror groups pop up and become bigger, it's going to be a easier and easier sell, not only to the American people, but also to, just kind of the Senate and the establishment powers to just let the president do this and take care of these groups before they become bigger problems. However, as we know, these anti-terror operations largely don't work, and the terrorist groups just become a bigger and bigger problem with more and more U.S. airstrikes. All right, that's it for the week. Hope everybody enjoyed it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. My news website is immersionnews.com, and the Minds page is minds.com/immersionnews. Thanks, everyone.